Hello, everyone. Welcome back to episode 2 of the Hawk and Dove podcast. In today's episode, we are going to do a reaction video to an interview done on Judge Napolitano's Judge and Freedom channel with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Macgregor has been a frequent guest on shows that are more sympathetic to the Russian view of things and the Russian narrative for the war. Since the beginning of the war, Macgregor has been bold in his predictions on Russian victory, which includes saying in the beginning of the war that Russia would encircle the Ukrainian army in the Donbass region and annihilate them. Over 200,000 Ukrainian KIA without any serious proof to his claims, and a general sense that Russian victory is inevitable. So instead of doing the usual research-oriented educational videos on foreign policy subjects, I thought it'd be a nice feature of this channel to do reaction videos in order to hold people accountable for their opinions and beliefs on certain topics, especially the important ones like the Ukraine war. Before we get started on this, it is the Hawk and Dove hours, so I will say that for this interview, I had to pull open a bottle of Bulleit bourbon, something that is affordable and decent in order to get through interviews like this and retain my sanity. So without further ado,
all right, let's talk about the wish of President Zelensky and his military commander for tanks, and the absurd footsie that the Americans seem to be playing with the Germans over the tanks. Everybody wants these German tanks, and Joe Biden's getting in the middle of it. Do they know what the hell they're doing?
even before Colonel Macgregor starts speaking, I should address the point Judge Napolitano brings up, and that is the negotiations for these new tanks. For any negotiation among a large coalition of partners, which NATO, the EU are all part of, it should be stressed that these are complex coalitions with multitude of factions and interests in the Ukraine war. So to reach a consensus on really anything is an effort in itself. And for these tanks to get sent, it requires a large commitment and agreement among at least a dozen important members. I know this stands in contrast to the popular pro-Russian argument that the United States just controls the world and the CIA leads every single change of government that is counter to pro-Russian interests.
The attitude of the Washington community, and that I'm talking about those people that are the leading senators, members of the House, cabinet officers, president, vice president. The mood of these people has clearly changed. I think they're sensing that this is a lost cause. That Ukraine is very definitely going to lose. And they're trying to figure out, how do we prolong the suffering? How do we prolong this fighting? They'll say publicly it's for the purpose of, quote unquote, harming Russia, which has been a complete fiasco and a disaster, because Russia, frankly, has not been harmed very much. Not at all, I would say, in substantive terms, economically, financially, otherwise.
Just in that statement alone should be a clear indication that perhaps this commentary isn't really worth your time. Because I don't think the loss of over 100,000 men for a war that was opportunistic because of Russian leadership, including the intelligence services within the Russian Federation that decided the Ukrainian government was weak and would collapse if the door was kicked in, and the response from the collective West would be minimal, especially considering how the Afghanistan withdrawal went and the propaganda from both Russia and China spoke of a American decline across the world. And as an Army officer, I am also quite perplexed by Colonel Macgregor's analysis that over 5,000 Russian officers have died in this war. And that is by far the cream of the crop in the next generation of Russian leaders throughout the entire country. They are the future leaders of the Russian Federation, and they are now gone. And that's just the casualties within the Russian military. I haven't even got into diplomatic relations with its Eastern European neighbors, especially the Baltic states, Finland, Sweden, Poland, Romania, Moldova, who are all now rearming, militarizing, all against Russia. They are not pointing their weapons west, they are pointing their weapons east.
But I think that's part of it. The second thing is that they're now really goading the Europeans, the Germans in particular, into committing acts that, frankly, can be regarded legally anywhere in the world as acts of war against Russia. And I think the German government is sitting there saying, do we really want to supply heavy military equipment, tanks, artillery, all these things in great quantities to this war zone to help these Ukrainians fight the Russians? Are we not, in fact, becoming co-belligerents? Now, you and I have talked before about this.
Yes.
I don't think there's any doubt about it. We are co-belligerents, but I think the Germans are now interested in putting the brakes on that. So Scholz put us in a difficult position because his representative at Ramstein last week at the conference for donors and allies that were willing to send things to Russia said that the only way the Germans would send any tanks, Leopard tanks, was if we sent M1s. Then we went through a series of comments from people in the Department of Defense, like this Mr. Colin Kahl, Assistant Secretary of Defense in OSD, who said, well, the M1 is a gas guzzler, and it has extreme maintenance requirements. It's too complex for the Ukrainians. It won't help them. The Leopard's easier for them to use, and the Leopard would be better.
Now, you've agreed with that, haven't you?
Oh, well, I agree with it, but not for the reasons that Mr. Kahl said. I mean, we've known for 30 years that the gas turbine engine's a catastrophe, both for reasons of fuel usage, but also because of the intake of all the dirt and sand and nonsense on the ground. This is an engine designed for the use of a jet at 15,000 feet, not for use on the ground. So here we have this turbine engine that's supposed to power this tank up and send it at 50 or 60 miles an hour towards the enemy. The problem is that historically, that's not necessarily what you need from the tank. I mean, tank doesn't have to go 50 or 60 miles an hour. We don't need to cover all that ground again, but the bottom line is that the M1's got a lot of problems. There's no question about it. I don't think people wanted to see this employed for the fear that they would be embarrassed by its performance. Not the gun, not the crew, but the tank as a whole, for the reasons we mentioned.
It's very curious on why he brings up the M1 Abrams tanks and all of its mechanical issues, but fails to bring up equivalent Russian tank issues such as the T-14 Armata being an absolute disaster in the Ukrainian battlefield. Moreover, and sticking just to the M1 Abrams, why is he not discussing that the M1 Abrams that are being sent to Ukraine are the older version and models, without the composite armor upgrade of depleted uranium? Also, I would add this issue of American tanks getting sent. The big reason why the Americans didn't want to send any tanks was largely the logistic issues. No European country operates the Abrams tanks as their main battle tank. A lot of countries maintain and use the Leopard tanks, however. And that's the whole reason why sending Abrams tanks didn't really make much sense. And it was a tactic by the German government to get around sending or okaying Leopard tanks getting sent to Ukraine. It was a political tactic to save face with the Russian government, which the Germans and their foreign policy since the 1990s, and even more so into the 1970s, want to do. They want to maintain good relations with the Russians, despite the fact that their Eastern European neighbors, Britain and the United States, and to a certain extent France and Italy, all are beyond that point. Lastly, the German people are divided on this issue. I think it could be summed up pretty well in almost every other voting bloc, where a third of people say they are against a certain policy, a third of people are for a policy, and then you have a neutral third who can be flipped either way. So this isn't a policy that is broadly favored by the German public, but at the same time, it's not a policy that is universally disapproved by the German public. A link to a story covering German polls on this topic will be in the description below.
Now the tables have turned. In order to get the Germans to send tanks, apparently President Biden said, well, we'll send 10 M1s. And Mr. Schultz responded by saying, well, fine, then we'll send 10 Leopards. Now, this seems childish and stupid, but I think we need to understand what's really happening. Number one, people have no faith in Ukraine's ability to win this war. We have been lying about what's happening in Ukraine between the Russian and Ukrainian forces for months. We have been exaggerating Russian losses, exaggerating Russian problems, and minimizing and obviating Ukrainian problems and losses. The truth is seeping out. You can't conceal it much longer. So the first thing is they know they can't win. In other words, we're losing the proxy war. Our proxy can't win it.
This line of argument makes absolutely no sense from an investment standpoint. Barring what you think about the politics of the Ukraine war, why would the most capitalistic regions of the entire world, Europe and the United States, be willing to invest so much resources into Ukraine and increasing those resources? At the very beginning of the war, Russia was threatening retaliation for NLAWs and javelins. Then it was HIMARS. Then it was other artillery systems. Now it's tanks. So European countries and the United States realize that there really isn't a barrier to sending assets and increasing assets into Ukraine. Rather, there's going to be no retaliation from the Russians. And as an investment, the United States and collective West are backing a winner. And I'll use an example from history for this situation. Back in the American Revolutionary War, France was waging, admittedly, a proxy war against Britain. They saw an opportunity to drain British resources and gain a victory from the war they had lost during the 7 Years' War. At first, the French simply sent armaments. Eventually, they sent advisors, more arms, cannon, money, and eventually declared war and sent a fleet. So it shouldn't be surprised that escalating, and I've heard one Russian commentator call it as the escalating escalator, even though the war continues to go on and there isn't a clear sign of victory by either side. Wars are decided by force buildup and trends, and then they meet at a decisive point, which Clausewitz called the culminating point, in where victory is decided. And both sides are building up their forces. I'm not arguing that the Russians are unable to launch an offensive in the spring, but I am very disturbed by the commentary that I've heard, admittedly on both sides of the Ukraine issue, that one side is going to completely wipe the floor with the other side because of X great new asset that's getting sent to either side. So I would be very hesitant to agree with McGregor's analysis that the collective West sees the Ukrainian war as a loss, even though the Ukrainians themselves are not running out of manpower. All they need is equipment. And they're getting that now with an iron fist from the main body tanks that are being supplied from Western countries, new longer range HIMARS rockets, which the Russians have completely failed to destroy. And now they're talking about sending F-16 or other fourth generational fighters. That should scare the Russians. But the Russians haven't launched a second wave of mobilization. Throughout the war, Russia has a manpower advantage just from the sheer size of their country and population. So this war is far from over, and it really comes down to who can mobilize the national resources better, more efficient, and actually use them in an effective manner.
In other words, we're losing the proxy war. Our proxy can't win it. Secondly, the Europeans are concluding that this is dangerous. You know, how far out do we stick our necks? And they don't have the military-industrial power to rapidly produce anything. And I think this is enormously important. The lead time, for instance, for the AMRAAM missile, which is a very important weapon that's used in the F-15, the F-22, the F-35, and by NASAMS, this brilliant, what I would call it, brilliant air defense system that we and the Norwegians have put together with Kongsberg. It's excellent for shooting down cruise missiles, helicopters, so forth. The problem is that from the moment you ask for a missile, the wait time until you get it is 32 months.
Oh.
That's how long it takes to produce these things. When you look at all of the missiles that we're promising the Ukrainians and the systems, they're not going to arrive in any short period of time. Now, the Germans are talking about giving the Ukrainians air defense systems like the Patriot, and they'll probably provide them with some missiles. But you'll go through those missiles very rapidly, and you just can't replace them. So the Europeans and we do not have the surge capacity to fight a major war. We just don't have it. The Russians do. Their factories are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Contrary to popular belief, they're not running out of anything. They've got more of what they need than they've ever had.
I'll leave it to other commentators on YouTube. I would suggest viewing Perun. He is a very good national defense analysis who goes over just how hard it is to wage war in the modern sense. For lack of a better phrase, the Russians had a shitload of material in their warehouses at the start of the war from the Russian legacy. But it's extremely hard to rationalize the collective West, NATO, from ever being able to surge their economies towards war production. Because one of the great critiques of President Trump during his tenure as president of NATO was the defense spending. He never questioned the purpose of NATO in the first place. He questioned the commitment of its members towards NATO, particularly the Germans, which also included his critique of their foreign policy of relying on cheap Russian gas. Boy, has that opinion aged like fine wine. But Colonel Macgregor, thinking that the Russians would somehow be able to outproduce the collective West when the collective West isn't even really on a war footing, should really be questioned, especially in the latest National Defense Authorization Act passed by the United States. We're seeing figures well above what the previous year's allocation and goals were. Just for one instance, the United States will up its production of 155 millimeter artillery shells to 500% increase from its previous level, or something around that number of artillery shells. But the point still stands that the United States is increasing its war production. As much as people like Judge Napolitano or Douglas Macgregor like to criticize the military-industrial complex, we haven't really even seen the full production of the United States military-industrial complex.
Said of this last statement you made, that you have sensed from public sources and I guess from the people with whom you communicate regularly, a change in attitude on the part of decision makers in Washington. Now, I would imagine that what you have sensed is below the radar, and it hasn't yet bubbled up into the public consciousness.
No.
I mean, maybe Joe Biden's a bad example, but a hawk like Lindsey Graham, you're not going to hear him saying tomorrow the Russians are going to win and we ought to get the hell out of there, even though he may be whispering that to your friends and colleagues in D.C.
Well, see, that's an important point because I don't think they're whispering that. See, this is the great danger that we face right now. A couple of historians contacted me and they insisted they talk to me. And they walked me through all of the things that FDR did as president in the 1930s to effectively goad the Japanese into attacking our forces in the Pacific.
Right.
And we all knew, I mean, contrary to popular beliefs, the Navy, the Army, Marshall, the CNO of the Navy, Stark, all these people knew that the Japanese could, in fact, attack and destroy Pearl Harbor. And in the run-up to the war, FDR did several things. He put out something called the McCullum Memorandum and directed the Navy to deliberately violate Japanese home waters.
Yes.
And they did it with warships again and again and again. And he was told by the CNO, we could lose some ships. He said 2 or 3 ships is okay if we have to lose that. I mean, this is incomprehensible today, but that's what he said. And ultimately, they told him what the implications were, and he said, continue to do it. Ultimately, we know what happens. He leaves the fleet deliberately in 1941 in June in Pearl Harbor. He does not return the fleet to San Diego and San Francisco, where normally in Puget Sound, that's where the fleet in the Pacific was quartered, not in Hawaii. And the CNO said, Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. President, we're targets.
We're sitting ducks.
We could lose the fleet. Ultimately, you know the rest of the story. He deliberately did this. There are a lot of other things. He was sending as many bombers as he could to China, to Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers at the time. He wanted to build up an air force there that could firebomb Japan from China. This is in 1939, 40, 41. We don't talk about any of these things. And what they said is what is happening right now looks an awful lot like what FDR did.
All right, time to grind my axe on this particular point. I really hate the revisionist history of America pre-World War II in the Pacific. Macgregor doesn't bring up the fact that the Japanese were expanding into Korea, Manchuria, China, French Indochina, all throughout this period. Kind of sounds like another country who is doing territorial expansion in our current day and age. And reading through the 8 points that the McCulloch Memorandum brings up, this is more of a proxy war containment at its best, giving as much charity to Macgregor's argument as I can. Because the whole reason that the Pacific Fleet was left inside Pearl Harbor and not at its usual port of San Diego was to ensure that a rapid response force would reach the Philippines. He fails to bring up that the United States military at the time had 100,000 troops exposed under Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines, which would, right as it happened in World War II, would be isolated and cut off if the Japanese achieved a surprise attack. And that's eventually what ended up happening, and it was a humiliating loss to the United States, along with the British, who had their teeth kicked in Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore. So why do I bring all this up? It's because history can be manipulated by those who tell it. And Macgregor and a large portion of pro-Russian commentators are very good at manipulating history and historical events, because our day and age, people are just very ignorant about historical events, especially when they fit ideology and narratives. So I think this is probably a good stopping point for the video for today, otherwise it'll probably go on for another hour or so. But I wanted to leave you, the listener, with a historian's view of the current Russian-Ukrainian conflict, because this war has been going on really since 2014 in the more kinetic, active sense. But this is really a struggle that has existed for at least over a century when it comes to Ukrainian national identity. The quote that I'm about to read is from a book called Lost Kingdom by Sergei Plokhine. I believe I'm mispronouncing your name, so I apologize to the author of this book. But in the epilogue, he writes, quote, "The result of the conflict, meaning the conflict in the Donbass region during 2014, 2015, and that was on and off up until the Russian invasion in 2022, Russia became more ethnically Russian and Ukraine more ethnically Ukrainian. More and more Ukrainians of all ethnic backgrounds tend today to embrace Ukrainian culture as a symbol of their identity." So I believe that's where the real conflict in this war has occurred. It is between a country that had never really had a national identity in its existence, that suddenly in 1991 found an independent state but no independent identity past the shared heritage that they had during the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Now this war is about what will Ukraine be? Will they be a sovereign independent country, or will they be once again under the thumb of Russian subjugation? And I will continue to make reaction videos of commentators like Douglas McGregor, Napolitano, and others to show that this war is not simply about a Russia versus the West battle. It is primarily a war of Ukrainian independence from Russian influence. And it falls on American foreign policy makers to, one, resolve this conflict not in a peace settlement that will just be a kick the can down the road to another conflict, but actually resolve this conflict in a manner that is just to the Ukrainians who have suffered the most from this war in terms of their homes being shelled, their grid and infrastructure being strategically bombed by an aggressive neighbor. And it falls on American leadership in the rest of the world to organize a coalition that will help stabilize the European continent in order to bring a prosperous future. This has been Dominic Grant. Thank you for listening. God bless. Vivo Cristo Rey.